He walked into Turin with a camera in his hand, not a Bible. He came expecting to photograph a scam, a medieval prop, a painted cloth behind glass that fooled tourists and filled the offering plates of priests. What he photographed instead is something science still cannot explain 46 years later. And now, at 78 years old, after a lifetime of refusing to call it a miracle, Barry Schwartz has finally said the words he spent his entire career trying not to say. What we found is impossible. Scientifically, medically, historically impossible. Yet it is real. This is the story of a Jewish skeptic who walked into a cathedral with an assignment and walked out with a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. And the new DNA results that just came in may be the strangest piece of evidence yet. Stay with this one, because by the end, you will understand why a man who has spent decades refusing to draw conclusions is finally admitting that something on that cloth should not exist. Let's start where it all began. October 1978. Turin, Italy. A team of more than 30 American scientists is granted something the Vatican had almost never granted before. 5 days. 5 nights. Unrestricted access to the most controversial piece of cloth in human history. Physicists, chemists, forensic specialists, image analysts, textile experts, some Christian, some Jewish, some agnostic, tied to institutions like Los Alamos National Laboratory and major universities. Their mission was not to defend faith. Their mission was to chase the evidence. And the man chosen to record every inch of it through a lens was a 32-year-old technical photographer from Los Angeles, Jewish, precise, detached, born in 1946, trained in scientific, medical, and industrial photography, the kind of man who trusted what he could measure and dismissed what he could not. Barry Schwartz had no Christian agenda, no emotional investment in a relic, no interest in defending a religion that wasn't even his own. In his own words, he assumed it was probably a painting, a medieval forgery, a tourist attraction, a piece of religious superstition. He had zero interest in it from a religious perspective. That detachment is exactly what makes everything that follows so unsettling, because the cloth he was about to photograph measures 14 feet, 3 inches long, 3 feet, 7 inches wide, aged linen, faint sepia stains, a front and back impression of a man, as if the cloth had been laid lengthwise over a corpse and folded back over the head. A man who had been beaten, scourged, crucified through the wrists and feet, pierced in the side. Schwartz expected paint, pigment, brushstrokes, dye soaked deep into the fibers. He found none of it. No brushstrokes, no pigment layers, no paint thickness, no dye penetration, no stain bleeding through to the other side. The image, whatever it actually was, only touched the very outermost fibers of the cloth. A layer 200 to 600 nanometers thick, thinner than 1% of the width of a single human hair. Let that settle for a moment. A medieval forger with no microscope, no chemistry lab, no understanding of cellular structure would have had to discolor only the surface skin of each thread, without touching the inside, without bleeding through to the back, without leaving a single brushstroke behind. That's not how paintings behave. That's not how stains behave. That's not how dye behaves. Then they shined ultraviolet light across it. Old linen normally fluoresces under of. The background of the shroud glows the way old linen should. But the body image areas? They go dark. They refuse to fluoresce, as if the fibers there had been chemically altered, oxidized, aged at a different rate than the cloth surrounding them. Schwartz was watching his medieval forgery theory die under his own camera flash. And then came the moment that broke him. In 1976, 2 years before he ever set foot in Turin, researchers had run a photograph of the shroud through a VP8 image analyzer, a machine built to interpret spatial data the way NASA processes images of distant terrain. When you run a normal painting through a VP8, you get garbage, distortion, nonsense. Because paintings encode light and shadow, not spatial distance. When they ran the shroud through it, a coherent 3-dimensional human body rose out of the data. The closer the cloth would have been to the body, the darker the image. The farther away, the lighter. The face, the chest, the hands folded across the pelvis, a real human form, encoded in distance. Photography wasn't invented until the 1820s. 3-dimensional image analysis didn't exist until the 20th century. So tell me, how did a medieval forger encode photographic negative properties and spatial depth information into a piece of linen centuries before either concept existed in the human mind? Take a breath. Because we are only getting started. When they tested the dark stains, the chemistry came back consistent with real blood. Hemoglobin. Positive test for serum albumin. Wounds matching scourging across the back and legs. Wounds at the wrists, not the palms, exactly where Roman crucifixion would drive iron. A wound on the side, consistent with a spear thrust between the ribs. John, chapter 19, verse 34. One of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. John, chapter 19, verse 40. They took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Matthew, Mark, Luke, every single gospel. A linen cloth, a scourged man, a pierced side, a tomb. Schwartz did not want any of this. He had no theological reason to want this. He was a Jewish photographer documenting an assignment. But the deeper he went, the more the cloth refused to behave like a fake. In 1981, the Shroud of Turin Research Project released its findings. The image is of a real human form. The man appears scourged and crucified. The image is not the product of an artist. The blood is real blood. And the mechanism that formed the image remains unsolved. Unsolved. Not a painting, not a stain, not a scorch, not anything any chemist on Earth could replicate. That should have ended the skeptical narrative right there. But then came 1988. The Vatican authorized radiocarbon dating. Samples were cut from a single corner of the cloth and shipped off to 3 laboratories: Oxford, Arizona, Zurich. The results came back nearly identical. 1260 to 1390 AD. Medieval. The headlines exploded around the world. Shroud is a fake. Forgery confirmed. Faith debunked by science. And Schwartz? He was shaken. Genuinely shaken. He did not want to be the man defending a fraud. But something kept gnawing at him. Because that single corner, the only corner ever sampled, was not just any corner. It was the corner pilgrims had clutched for centuries. The corner damaged in the 1532 fire that nearly destroyed the cloth. The corner that had been handled, repaired, possibly rewoven with newer threads. Stay with me here. This is where most people stopped paying attention. And it is exactly where the truth was hiding. You don't date a 5,000-year-old mummy by sampling the cotton patch on the bandage. You don't date a Rembrandt by testing the frame. But that is essentially what happened in 1988. A 2022 study using wide-angle X-ray scattering on a shroud linen sample suggested the fibers were compatible with a far older age than the carbon dating concluded. It is debated. It is not settled. But the sampling problem from 1988 has never gone away. And then, decades later, came the part of this story almost no one is talking about. The Dina. In 2015, Italian researchers analyzed dust particles vacuumed from the shroud. They found human genetic material. They found plant DNA. They found traces of contact with environments stretching from Europe through the Middle East. Interesting. Inconclusive. A footnote in a much larger debate. Until the reanalysis. According to the recent findings Schwartz himself has spoken about, advanced sequencing of those samples returned something that should not be there. Genetic markers clearly identified as Homo sapiens. Human. Without question human. But the patterns did not fit. Not modern European. Not Middle Eastern. Not African. Not Asian. Not ancient European. Not Neanderthal. Not Denisovan. Markers that looked archaic in some places and impossibly mixed in others. Like finding ancestry from populations that never overlapped on the map of human history. And these markers were not concentrated in random handling areas. According to the narrative coming out of these studies, they cluster around the image. Around the bloodstains. The very places that should reveal who, if anyone, this cloth once wrapped. There are 3 conventional explanations. Contamination from millions of pilgrims over centuries. Plausible, except the markers don't match the modern populations who handled it. An isolated ancient population we have never sequenced. Possible, but extraordinary. Sample degradation creating false readings. Always possible, but the patterns are too consistent. Each explanation has a hole in it. Each one sounds reasonable until you push on it. And this is the moment Barry Schwartz, the careful, cautious, evidence-driven Jewish photographer who spent 46 years refusing to call this a miracle, said the sentence that changed everything. This new DNA analysis. It changes everything. If you're still here, you already understand why this story matters. Take a moment before you keep watching and tell me in the comments what you believe this cloth really is. Because what comes next is the part that should make every honest skeptic and every honest believer stop and reconsider what they thought they knew. Schwartz is still careful. He is still a man who chooses his words like a surgeon. He still says, anomalous is not the same as miraculous. He still says, I present the data. I do not tell people what to believe. But he also says this. Dismissing the shroud as an obvious medieval forgery is no longer scientifically defensible. Read that again. Not from a priest, not from an apologist, not from a televangelist, from a Jewish scientific photographer who has spent almost half a century studying that cloth with a camera, a microscope, and a mind that demands proof. Now ask yourself something honest. If a 14-foot piece of linen carries the encoded image of a scourged, crucified man with real blood, with photographic negative properties 700 years before photography existed, with 3-dimensional spatial information no painter could fake, with image fibers altered at a depth thinner than 1% of a human hair, with DNA that does not match any known human population on Earth. What exactly are we looking at? Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Psalm 22, verse 16. They pierce my hands and my feet. Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. They will look on me, the one they have pierced. Written centuries before Roman crucifixion was even invented as a method of execution. And then, in the empty tomb, John chapter 20, verses 5 through 8. Peter and John race to the grave. They don't find a body. They find linen cloths, lying there, silent, folded, empty. What if the cloth is not the proof of a religion? What if it is the silent witness of a moment, the moment between death and resurrection, the moment when a body that had been beaten, scourged, pierced, and laid in linen suddenly was not there anymore? The image cannot be painted. The blood cannot be faked. The depth information cannot be invented by medieval hands. The DNA cannot be matched to any people group walking the earth today. Something happened inside that cloth. Something we still cannot reproduce in any laboratory on the planet. Schwartz will not say it is Jesus. He has never been willing to say that. He says the cloth is anomalous. He says the evidence resists conventional explanation. He says the more closely you examine it, the stranger it becomes. But here is what he will say, in his own words. The image should not exist by any conventional explanation. And here is what he will not say, but what every piece of evidence on that cloth keeps whispering. A man was wrapped in this linen. A man who had been scourged the way Jesus was scourged, crucified the way Jesus was crucified, pierced in the side the way Jesus was pierced, buried the way Jesus was buried, according to the customs of the Jews. Inside a linen cloth, inside a tomb cut from rock, and then something happened to that body that left a photographic negative with three-dimensional spatial encoding burned into the surface of the threads at a depth no human hand could replicate. With bloodstains that never bled through and biological traces that do not match any population on. Earth, before you keep scrolling, before you click away, before this story slips into the noise of the next thing, do one thing for me. If this content has moved you, if it has made you wrestle with something real, hit subscribe, drop a comment with the word witness, and share this with one person who needs to see what science is now refusing to dismiss. Because stories like this are being buried under louder voices, and the only way they reach the people who need them is through you. Now hear this last part carefully. Barry Schwartz did not become a Christian. He did not walk an aisle. He did not write a book of faith. He remained, in his own words, a skeptic in many ways, a Jewish man who simply refused to lie about what he had seen. And what he saw, after 46 years, after thousands of photographs, after radiocarbon dating, after STERP, after UV testing, after spectral analysis, after VP8 imaging, after the DNA results that came in and broke every conventional explanation, was a cloth that should not exist. Wrapped around a man who, according to every wound, every chemical trace, every prophecy from Isaiah and Psalms and Zechariah, looks exactly like the man the gospel writers described being laid in linen and placed inside a borrowed tomb on a Friday afternoon 2,000 years ago. A tomb that, 3 days later, was empty. Maybe the real lesson of the shroud is humility. Maybe science can measure the mystery, but cannot fully explain it. Maybe faith was never supposed to be afraid of evidence. Maybe evidence was never supposed to be afraid of faith. But maybe, just maybe, the cloth is doing exactly what it has been doing for centuries. Bearing silent witness, waiting for you to look at the wounds, the blood, the image that cannot be painted, the DNA that cannot be placed, and ask the only question that actually matters. If a medieval forger did not do this, if chemistry cannot do this, if biology cannot do this, if human hands cannot do this, then who, exactly, walked out of that linen? And what does it mean that after 46 years of trying to explain him away, science is quietly running out of answers?